mistake people make. Some say complementarianism leads to abuse and therefore it's bad. This is probably the most common thing I see, and it'll be a lot easier to follow. It's not about philosophy, no syllogism to put on the screen. It goes like this: abusive behavior towards women rules out differences in roles. Now they don't say it outright, but that's what it is. It's there. I'm going to give you examples of times where men have abused women, and it's going to show you that you can't put women in submission to these kinds of circumstances. Now I've been a domestic violence counselor. I've worked close hand with people. I've been on the phone with a woman, real life, on phone with a woman who calls me in panic because I'm her husband's DV counselor to tell me that he's chasing them with a knife. They've locked themselves in a room and he's at the door pounding with a knife. Right? I was the guy on the phone with her when she went, climbed out the window, took her kids to the police station, and I stayed on the phone with her. Right? And she takes me to the police station. She reports her husband, and then the cop didn't want to do a report, so they sent her back. So she tells me they're sending me away. So I called and I talked to the station manager and said, I'm a DV counselor. You guys need to take this woman in and deal with her and help her. And I advocated for her. Look, what I'm trying to say here is, as sad as this is to have to do, I'm not somebody who supports or endorses abuse towards women, right? We have a rule in our marriage. We do not call each other names, not mean names. Names like honey are okay. It doesn't happen. I do not yell at my wife. My wife does not yell at me. That sort of thing just doesn't happen in our home. I know that sounds weird to some people, but we don't do that because I saw enough of that growing up. I was really worried to see it in my marriage, and I don't want to see anything like that. Not supporting that stuff at all. But the type of story-driven theology that says that these real horrific examples of abuse are simply the automatic result of the evils of complementarianism, they're A, I think it's false, and B, it keeps you from reading the Bible. The Bible cannot make you change your mind on these issues because you've decided and you are emotional about it and you are intense about it. Let me give you some examples of how this works. One book that I'll point to, which is not very good in any measure, as far as I can tell, is, no offense to anybody, I read a bunch of books, and of all of them, this is towards the bottom of the list, right? But Beth Allison Barr's book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, how the subjugation of women became gospel truth. In the introduction to her book, she does this sort of what I'll call story-driven theology. Okay, see if you can track with me on this. The intro, she talks about how her husband was fired after he challenged church leadership on the issue of women in ministry. That's on page 3. It begins with this long story of just all the hurt that has come to her and come to women. That's the framing for the whole book. This sent them away from their church with salt in their wounds, pushing them into silence about what was really going on. I'm trying to share the story kind of the way she does. She's a better storyteller than I am, so it's more intense. But they had to leave the youth they discipled for 14 years. They lost friends over these issues. She says, and I quote from her introduction, "I could feel the raw edges of grief, anger, and righteous indignation rising up inside me." And I just want to say this. If you approach the topic of women in ministry with raw edges of grief, anger, and righteous indignation, you're not going to be able to let the Bible guide and direct you here. I can't view the world through my pain. Like, you can't look at the world this way. If you've been abused by a husband, you can't then look at marriage through that abuse. If you've been hurt by a church leader, you can't then look at church as a whole through the hurt, through the pain you've experienced through that church. It's going to mess up our ability to think clearly about things, and we'll only see bathwater and we'll never see babies. That's just the way it is. So she goes on. Beth Allison Barr sees the hurt and pain that she experienced, and which is in countless other stories, and she tells these stories throughout her book, and she sees it as caused by complementarianism. And she's very clear: you cannot separate the issues. The abuse is complementarianism. These two are the same thing. You will not read her book without feeling it. Complementarians are bad. Their views have hurt people, especially women. That is the main theme of the book. It's not really about theology so much, or about understanding scripture in context. It's about telling stories to create theology for you by viewing an issue through the lens of pain. Pain can teach us. Pain can be helpful. It can also confuse us. It can also distort our perspective on things. And so we just have to be aware of that. Let me give you an example of how this works. How stories are used to overrule your thinking. This is a story about a complementarian student she has, and she's a well-educated professor teaching at a university, right? And so Beth Allison Barr is teaching, and she has, I think I have the quote. No, I don't have the quote. Yeah, I'll just read it to you. So in her book, she has this on page 16 and 17, and she says, one student was particularly vocal. This is about her, this kind of punk student she had. He was theologically conservative and expressed concern about my choice to continue teaching as a wife and mother, especially as a pastor's wife, because she's teaching at a university. He challenged me so often in the classroom that I took to rewriting lecture material, trying to minimize his disruptions. I wasn't successful. Once the student suggested that I clear my teaching material with my husband before presenting it to my classroom. This both angered and unnerved me. It angered me that he thought it appropriate to suggest that I submit my teaching materials to the authority of my husband. It unnerved me because every semester I worried about how my vocation as a female professor clashed with conservative Christian expectations about female submission. So, I mean, her student was I mean, he was a young punk, right? Like, he's just a young, like, kid who's up on his high horse being rude and saying weird things. But her point isn't that that's some weird young guy. Her point is that's conservative Christianity. Like, I want you to view all of Christianity through the lens of the pain of this experience. Let me show you how this is the case. As you read on in her book, you get to page 17 and 18. This is just immediately after the story of the kid. And she's responding now to Russell Moore, who wants to say that complementarianism isn't abusive and it's not the same thing as patriarchy, that there is such a thing as a non-abusive role differences between men and women. She's very against that, and she's going to use the story of this kid, story-based theology, to reinforce it. Let me read from her book now. She says, while Russell Moore, writes that Scripture demolishes the idea that women in general are to be submissive to men in general, which I agree with, he explains wifely submission as cultivating, quote, a voluntary attitude of recognition toward godly leadership. Thus, Russell Moore, according to Beth Allison Barr, thus his general attitude remains unchanged. Women should not submit to men in general, that's pagan patriarchy, but wives should submit to their husbands, that's Christian patriarchy. Nice try, I thought. Listen to how she overrules what he's saying. Nice try, I thought. Tell that to my conservative male student, because that student considered me to be under the authority of my husband. He was less willing to accept my authority over him in a university classroom. No matter how much Moore wants to separate pagan patriarchy from Christian patriarchy, he can't. Both systems place power in the hands of men and take power away from women. Both systems teach men that women rank lower than they do. Both systems teach women that their voices are worth less than the voices of men. Page 17 and 18 in The Making of Biblical Womanhood. All nuance is gone. All distinctions are gone. Her point, look, here's what I honestly see. To be super honest with you guys. I see someone saying, pagan patriarchy is messed up. I'm going to make a case that no matter what you say, any version of Christian, like, role differences between men and women, it just is messed up pagan patriarchy. And if you try to tell me, hey, look, I've got these verses, I've got these policies, I've got these rules, I've got these beliefs, I've got all this scripture, I'm going to tell you, nice try, tell that to my story. My story overrules all of that stuff and becomes the policy for how I'm going to view these issues through the lens of pain.